A baby was left in a sack to die in the creek. Then she whispered, "Mama," to the cowboy who saved her, Elias. Mercer was a quiet cowboy who lived a simple life on the edge of dustpine territory. He was not a man who talked much, and he did not like trouble. Most days, he rode alone across wide open land, watching the horizon, fixing fences, and helping where he was needed. Life had made him calm, but also a little lonely. The world felt big, and Elias often felt like a small part of it. One late afternoon, the sky was turning orange and gold. The wind moved slowly through the dry grass. Elias was riding his horse along a narrow path near a creek. This place was far from the town, and usually very silent. The sound of water was soft, and birds were flying back to their nests. Elias was about to turn back home when something strange caught his attention. At first, it was just a small sound. He stopped his horse and listened carefully. The wind moved again, but this time he heard it more clearly. It was not the sound of water or animals. It was something softer, like a weak cry. He slowly got down from his horse and walked toward the creek. The ground near the water was muddy, and tall grass moved around his boots. The sound came again, even weaker than before. Elias followed it carefully, step by step, until he reached the edge of the creek. There, half hidden between rocks and reeds, he saw something that made him freeze. It was a small sack, old and wet, caught in the shallow water. At first he thought it might be trash or something the river had carried. But then the sack moved slightly. Elias quickly knelt down and opened it with careful hands. What he saw inside made his heart stop for a moment. It was a baby, a newborn child, wrapped poorly, cold and weak, but still alive. The baby's tiny face was red, and her small hands moved slowly, as if she was trying to reach for help. Elias had seen many things in his life, but this was something he was not prepared for. He looked around quickly, expecting someone nearby, but the land was empty. Only the sound of the creek and wind filled the air. It felt like the world had placed this child here and then walked away. Elias gently lifted the baby into his arms. She was so small that she barely filled his hands. He held her close to his chest, trying to give her warmth. He removed his coat and wrapped it around her carefully. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then something surprising happened. The baby opened her eyes slightly and made a small sound. It was not a cry anymore. It was soft, broken, and almost like a word. Ma, ma. Elias stopped breathing for a second. He looked down at her, unsure if he had really heard it. The baby's eyes were barely open, but she seemed to be searching for something she had lost. That single word stayed in Elias's mind. It was simple, but it carried something heavy. He did not know who she was, or where she came from, or why she was left there. But in that moment, something inside him changed. He looked at the empty land around him again. The sun was lower now, and shadows were growing longer. He knew he could not leave her there. Not now. Not after hearing that small, fragile voice. Carefully, Elias placed the baby in his saddlebag, making sure she was safe and warm. He mounted his horse slowly and turned toward Dustpine Town. The ride ahead felt longer than usual, even though the road had not changed. As he rode, he kept glancing down at the baby. She was quiet now, resting against his coat. The wind moved past them, and the sky slowly turned darker. Elias did not know what would happen next. He did not know whose child she was or why she had been left alone. But one thing was clear in his mind. This moment had changed his path. And somewhere in the distance, Dustpine was waiting, with its secrets, its silence, and a truth that had not yet been uncovered. Elias Mercer rode slowly toward Dustpine, the small frontier town that stood like a tired shadow in the middle of empty land. The baby was safe inside his coat, wrapped tightly to keep her warm. She no longer made much sound, only soft breaths that rose and fell like a fragile promise of life. The road to Dustpine was rough and dusty. The sun was beginning to lower, and long shadows stretched across the land. Elias usually liked this time of day, but today his mind was not calm. Every few minutes he looked down to make sure the child was still breathing. Each small movement she made reminded him that she was real, and that someone had left her behind. When he finally reached Dustpine, the town looked the same as always. Wooden buildings stood tired and old. A few horses were tied outside the saloon. Men sat on porches, watching the road with quiet, suspicious eyes. Dustpine was not a friendly place for strangers, and even less for trouble. Elias noticed how people reacted when they saw him. Their eyes shifted quickly, some turning away, others watching too closely. News traveled fast in small towns, and somehow, it already felt like they knew something was different. He went straight to the small clinic at the edge of town. The doctor there, an old woman named Clara, opened the door and looked surprised when she saw him holding a baby. "What happened?" she asked quickly, stepping aside to let him in. "I found her by the creek," Elias said simply. His voice was calm, but his eyes were serious. Clara took the baby gently and placed her on a warm blanket. She checked the child carefully, her face showing both concern and confusion. "She's lucky to be alive," Clara said softly. "A little longer out there, and she wouldn't have made it." Elias did not reply. He only stood near the table, watching the baby closely. Something about her felt important, even though he did not understand why. Clara gave the baby warm milk and wrapped her properly. Slowly, the child began to relax. Her small hands stopped shaking, and her breathing became steadier. As Elias turned to leave, Clara stopped him. "You should be careful," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Why?" Clara hesitated for a moment. Then she spoke in a lower voice. "A child doesn't just end up in a place like that by accident, not around here." Elias understood what she meant. Dustpine had secrets. Everyone knew it, but no one spoke about it openly. Things happened in this town that were quickly buried and never talked about again. Outside the clinic, the town felt different now. Elias noticed two men standing near the saloon, watching him. They were not just curious, they were alert. One of them whispered something to the other, and both turned away quickly when Elias looked back. That night, Elias stayed in a small rented room above a stable. The baby was with Clara, but his mind could not rest. He kept thinking about the creek, the sack, and that small voice saying "Mama." Something about it did not feel random. It felt connected to something larger, something hidden. Later that night, a soft knock came at his door. Elias opened it slowly. A young stable boy stood outside, nervous and looking around. "You shouldn't stay here too long," the boy said quickly. "Why?" Elias asked. The boy hesitated, then whispered, "That baby. People are talking. Some don't want her found." Before Elias could ask more, the boy turned and ran off into the dark. Elias stood still for a moment, watching the empty street. The wind moved dust across the wooden boards, and the town looked even quieter than before. But now it did not feel peaceful. It felt watchful. Inside the room, Elias sat down slowly. He took off his hat and placed it on the table. For the first time, he realized this was not just about finding a lost child. Something had been set in motion the moment he picked her up from the creek, and Dustpine, with all its silence and shadows, was not going to let it stay simple. Somewhere in the town, people already knew more than they were saying, and Elias Mercer had just stepped into something much bigger than a quiet ride home. The next morning in Dustpine began like any other day, but Elias Mercer could feel something different in the air. The town was quiet, but it was not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like people were watching even when they were not seen. Elias went early to the clinic to check on the baby. Clara told him the child was doing better. She was warm, fed, and finally resting without shaking. For the first time since he found her at the creek, Elias felt a small sense of relief. But that relief did not last long. Clara closed the door behind her and spoke in a low voice. "You need to understand something," she said carefully. "People in this town are asking questions about that child." Elias looked at her. "Who?" Clara hesitated. "Men who don't usually ask questions. Men who expect answers instead." Elias stayed quiet, but his expression hardened slightly. He had lived long enough to know what that meant. Some people in Dustpine were not just curious, they were afraid of what the truth might bring out. Outside, the town felt even more tense. Elias noticed that the same two men from the previous day were still around. They stood near the general store, pretending to talk, but watching everything. When Elias stepped outside, one of them turned his head slightly, as if to report his movement. Elias decided it was time to find answers. He started asking small questions around town, careful not to draw too much attention. Most people avoided speaking. Some looked uncomfortable. Others pretended they did not hear him at all. But slowly, small pieces of information began to connect. The baby had not been an accident. There were whispers of a wealthy ranching family that controlled much of the land around Dustpine. A powerful name that people spoke carefully, as if even saying it too loudly might bring trouble. Elias heard that this family had recently faced a scandal, something involving inheritance and hidden secrets. And somewhere in that story, a child had been born. A child that was never meant to be seen. That evening, Elias walked near the edge of town toward the old storage barns. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in deep orange colors. Dustpine looked almost beautiful from a distance, but up close it felt different. Like a place built on things people refused to talk about. As he passed one of the barns, he stopped suddenly. A voice came from inside. "He's asking too many questions." Elias stayed still, listening carefully. Another voice replied, "We should have made sure that baby never left the creek." The words hit him like cold wind. He did not move, but his mind sharpened instantly. Now he understood clearly. Someone in Dustpine knew exactly what had happened, and they did not want it uncovered. He stepped back quietly and left before he was seen. That night, Elias did not sleep. He stayed awake in his room, thinking. The baby was still safe with Clara, but now safety felt temporary. Something larger was moving in the background, and he had stepped right into its path. Around midnight, a soft knock came again. This time, it was not the stable boy. It was Clara. She looked worried as she entered. They came by earlier, she said quickly. 2 men. They asked about the child. Elias's eyes narrowed. What did you tell them? I told them nothing, she replied. But they will come again. She paused, then added something that changed the weight in the room. One of them said the child belongs to someone powerful, someone who would do anything to keep her hidden. Elias sat quietly for a moment. The pieces were finally coming together. The creak, the sack, the whispers. None of it had been random. The baby was not abandoned by accident. She had been removed from a situation someone wanted erased completely. Elias stood up slowly. Then we stop it here, he said calmly. Clara looked at him with concern. You don't understand what you are stepping into. Elias adjusted his coat and picked up his hat. I understand enough, he said. Outside, the wind moved through Dustpine like a warning. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed, and the town remained silent, unaware that the truth was no longer buried. Elias Mercer was no longer just a man passing through. He was now standing between a hidden truth and the people who would do anything to keep it buried. The night in Dustpine was colder than usual. The wind moved through the empty streets like it carried warnings that no one wanted to hear. Windows were shut tightly, and doors were locked early. The town felt like it was holding its breath. Elias Mercer stood outside the small clinic where the baby was staying. Clara had agreed to keep the child safe for the night, but even she looked worried. She had seen many things in her life, but this situation felt different. Something dangerous was closing in. Elias knew there was no more time to wait. He gently took the baby from Clara. The child was calm now, wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up at him with quiet eyes, as if she trusted him without question. That trust made something firm settle inside Elias's heart. I'll bring this to an end, he said quietly. Clara looked at him with concern. Be careful. These men don't care about truth. They care about control. Elias gave a small nod and walked out into the night. The town was silent, but not empty. Elias could feel eyes watching from behind windows and corners. He mounted his horse and rode slowly toward the creek, the place where it had all begun. The same creek that had once been quiet now felt different. The water still flowed, but the sound seemed heavier. The moonlight reflected on the surface like broken glass. Elias stopped near the edge and dismounted. He placed the baby carefully in a safe spot under a tree, wrapped warmly. She did not cry. She only watched him. Then he waited. It did not take long. Horse hooves echoed in the distance. 2 riders appeared first, then 3 more. They stopped near the creek, forming a line. Men stepped down slowly, their faces hard, their hands close to their weapons. One man stepped forward. He wore a dark coat and spoke with confidence. You should have stayed out of this, the man said. Elias looked at him calmly. A child was left here to die, he replied. That is not something I ignore. The man smiled slightly. That child was never supposed to be found. Silence followed those words. The truth was no longer hidden. The man continued. She is part of a problem that was already handled. You brought it back. Elias stood still, his voice steady. She is not a problem. She is a child. The man's expression hardened. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Elias looked toward the creek, then back at him. I understand enough. Enough to know what is right. For a moment, no one moved. The wind passed between them, carrying dust and tension. Then the leader raised his hand slightly, a signal. But before anything could happen, something unexpected broke the moment. A small sound came from under the tree. The baby had woken. She made a soft sound again, weak but clear. Ma! Ma! The word cut through everything. Even the men paused for a second. Elias did not move, but his eyes became sharper. That small voice changed everything in him. It reminded him why he was standing there. The leader shook his head. End this, he said coldly. But Elias stepped forward instead. No, he said firmly. This ends now. What followed was not chaos, but courage. Elias did not fight for revenge. He fought to protect what was innocent. One by one, the men lost their confidence, not because they were weak, but because the truth had already begun to break their control. The leader hesitated for the first time, and that hesitation was enough. The men slowly backed away, not all at once, but one after another, until only silence remained again at the creek. The leader stared at Elias for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and left without another word. The others followed. Dustpine's grip on the secret had finally broken. Elias walked back to the tree and picked up the baby. She was calm again, resting against him as if she had always belonged there. The danger was gone, but something new had begun. When morning came, the town of Dustpine was different. The whispers were quieter. The fear was not as strong. Some truths, once exposed, could not be buried again. Clara met Elias at the edge of town. She looked at the baby and then at him. "It's over?" she asked. Elias nodded. "For now." He looked down at the child in his arms. She was safe, but her story had only just begun. Clara asked softly, "What will you do now?" Elias looked toward the open road. The wind moved gently across the land, and the world felt wide again. He glanced at the baby once more. "She doesn't need to be found anymore," he said. "She needs to be raised."